A millionaire architect laughed at the gardener's drawing until he realized it was the solution for his project. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, have you ever had a brilliant idea that was dismissed by a boss? And at the end of the story, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Enjoy! Maxwell Blackwood was a man who worshipped at the altar of the straight line. His world was a meticulously constructed kingdom of glass, steel, and right angles. From his penthouse office, which offered a god's-eye view of the city, he reigned over Blackwood Designs, the most sought-after and feared architectural firm in the country. He was known as the god of geometry, a man who could create skyscrapers that pierced the clouds with breathtaking precision, but who was rumored to be allergic to curves, chaos, and human clutter. His buildings were magnificent, perfect, and utterly sterile, much like the man himself. His current obsession and the source of his escalating fury was the centerpiece of his magnum opus, the new headquarters for a global tech giant. The building itself was a masterpiece of minimalist design, a gleaming tower of white marble and obsidian glass. But the project had a fatal flaw, a festering wound in its perfect heart. The mandatory central atrium, a vast, glass-domed, public garden space that was supposed to be the building's soul. Right now, it had no soul. It was a green desert. "This is not a garden," Maxwell declared, his voice dangerously low as he stared at the holographic 3D model in the center of the conference room. "This is a mathematical error with leaves on it. It is cold. It is sterile. It is boring." His team of highly paid, world-renowned landscape architects shifted uncomfortably. They had been working on the atrium for 6 months, and every proposal they presented had been met with the same cold, dismissive fury. Blackwood, the lead architect, a man named Alistair, began nervously. "The design follows all the principles of modern, minimalist landscaping. The lines are clean, the plant selection is depressing," Maxwell cut in, his voice sharp as a shard of glass. "These are plants that look like they've given up on life. This is a space that is supposed to inspire innovation and creativity. Right now, it inspires the desire to take a long, sad nap." He pointed a trembling finger at the model. "The city's design commission is calling it soulless. The client is getting nervous. I have given you an unlimited budget, the best resources in the world, and you have produced a $100 million monument to beige. Fix it, or I will find someone who can." He stormed out of the conference room, leaving a trail of terrified silence in his wake. Meanwhile, 3 floors below, Flora Monroe was having a very serious conversation with a struggling fern in the main lobby. "Now listen to me, Ferdinand," she said, gently misting its leaves. "I know the air conditioning in here is a bit aggressive, and I know the lighting is less nurturing greenhouse and more dystopian spaceship. But you have to fight. You have good roots. You just need to believe in yourself." Flora was one of a dozen gardeners employed by the company that managed the building's landscaping. To the executives who strode past her every day, she was utterly invisible, just another part of the background, a woman in simple overalls with a bit of dirt permanently under her fingernails. But Flora didn't just see plants, she saw stories. She saw the quiet, stubborn resilience of a weed pushing through a crack in the pavement. She saw the joyful, chaotic explosion of a wildflower bed. She believed that a space, like a person, had a soul, and her job was to listen to what it wanted to be. She had been secretly heartbroken over the plans for the new atrium. She had seen the blueprints, left carelessly on a table one evening. It was all straight lines, symmetrical patterns, and plants chosen for their ability to be controlled. There was no wildness, no surprise, no joy. It was a garden designed by someone who didn't understand that the most beautiful things in nature are the ones that are a little bit messy. That afternoon, while on her break, she sat on a bench in the small park across the street, the only real patch of green in a canyon of concrete. She was sketching in a small, worn notebook she always carried. She wasn't an architect. She couldn't draw a technical blueprint to save her life. But she could draw feelings. She began to sketch the atrium, not as it was in the plans, but as she felt it should be. She drew curving, meandering paths instead of straight lines. She drew a small hidden waterfall that would fill the space with the sound of moving water. She drew clusters of mismatched, colorful flowers planted in chaotic, joyful bursts. She drew benches tucked away in quiet, secret nooks, places where people could read or talk or just be alone with their thoughts. She didn't draw a design. She drew a sanctuary. She was so lost in her work that she didn't hear the footsteps approaching until a shadow fell over her page. "What is that supposed to be?" a cold, condescending voice asked. Flora looked up, startled, into the intense, stormy gray eyes of Maxwell Blackwood. He was standing over her, looking down at her simple sketch with an expression of utter disdain. It's just a doodle," she stammered, quickly trying to close her notebook. But he was faster. He snatched the notebook from her hands before she could react. He held up her drawing, a cruel, mocking smile on his face. "A doodle," he repeated, his voice loud enough for several of his passing executives to hear. "This is your brilliant solution, is it? Finger painting? What is this, a garden for children?" The executives chuckled, eager to align themselves with their boss's mood. Flora felt her cheeks burn with a hot, fierce shame. She stood up, her small frame dwarfed by his towering presence, but her eyes were defiant. "It's a garden for people," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "It's designed to make people feel something. Peace, joy, surprise. Your design? It's designed to make people feel nothing at all." The directness of her challenge took him by surprise. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "And what would a gardener know about architectural theory?" he sneered. "I know that you can't force a rose to grow in a straight line, Mr. Blackwood," she shot back, her courage fueled by her indignation. "I know that a space without a heart is just a cage. You are building a monument to your own ego. I was trying to design a sanctuary for the human soul." The executives gasped. No one, ever, spoke to Maxwell Blackwood like that. He stared at her, a war of emotions on his face. He was furious at her insubordination. He was humiliated that she had dared to challenge him in front of his employees. But somewhere, deep beneath the layers of his arrogance, he was intrigued. She hadn't just insulted him, she had articulated the very problem he had been unable to solve. "A space without a heart." "You're bold," he said, his voice a low growl. "I'll give you that." He handed the notebook back to her. "You think your doodle is so brilliant? Prove it." "Prove it how?" she asked, her heart pounding. "My team of world-class architects has been working on this for 6 months and has failed," he said, his voice ringing with challenge. "I'm giving you until tomorrow morning. I want you to walk into my boardroom and present this sanctuary of yours. You will explain your design philosophy to me and my entire senior team. If you can convince us that there is a single shred of viable genius in this childish scribble, I will consider it." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "But if you fail, if you waste one more minute of my time, I will personally see to it that you are not just fired from this building, but that you never work as a gardener in this city again. Do we have an understanding?" Flora looked at him, at the impossible, unfair, and utterly terrifying challenge he had just thrown at her feet. She thought of her younger sister, whose art school tuition she was working 3 jobs to pay for. She thought of the years she had spent quietly studying, reading every book she could find on landscape design and biophilic architecture, her dreams always just out of reach. This was not just a challenge, it was a chance. She lifted her chin, her eyes meeting his with an unshakable resolve. "You'll have your presentation, Mr. Blackwood," she said, "and I suggest you and your team come prepared to take notes." Flora didn't sleep that night. She didn't have time for the luxury of rest. Her tiny apartment, a space usually overflowing with potted plants and stacks of second-hand books, became a makeshift architectural studio. The challenge Maxwell had thrown at her was designed to make her fail, to humiliate her into silence. She knew that. But he had made one critical miscalculation. He had underestimated her. He saw a gardener. He didn't see the woman who had spent the last 5 years devouring every text she could find on sustainable urban design, biophilic architecture, and the psychology of public spaces. She didn't own a fancy computer or 3D modeling software. Her tools were simpler, more elemental. She used charcoal, watercolors, and large sheets of butcher paper spread across her living room floor. She didn't just redraw her doodle, she gave it a soul. She mapped out the flow of human traffic, not with straight lines, but with gentle, meandering curves that mimicked the natural pathways of a forest floor. She researched and selected every single plant, not for its aesthetic obedience, but for its sensory properties. The calming scent of lavender, the soft rustle of ornamental grasses, the vibrant, surprising color of a hidden cluster of wildflowers. She designed a space that wasn't meant to be looked at from a distance, but to be experienced, a place to touch, to smell, to hear. She sketched a small, almost hidden water feature, a whispering wall, where water would trickle down a surface of moss-covered stones, creating a gentle, soothing sound that would mask the distant hum of the city. She designed benches made from reclaimed wood, each one tucked into a private nook, creating small sanctuaries for solitude within the larger public space. Her design wasn't just a garden, it was an argument. It was a passionate, brilliantly articulated thesis statement that human well-being was not a luxury, but a necessity, even in the heart of a corporate empire. By dawn, her apartment was a beautiful, chaotic mess of sketches, plant lists, and watercolor renderings. Flora herself was exhausted, running on pure adrenaline and 3 cups of cheap, strong coffee. She put on her cleanest pair of overalls, a simple white t-shirt, and her worn-out work boots. She wasn't going to pretend to be one of them. She would walk into that boardroom as exactly who she was, a gardener. When she arrived at Blackwood Designs at 8 a.m., carrying a large rolled-up portfolio of her drawings, the receptionist stared at her as if she had arrived for a plumbing emergency. "I have a meeting with Mr. Blackwood," Flora said, her voice steady despite the frantic butterflies in her stomach. The woman's skepticism was palpable. "Your name?" "Flora Monroe." The receptionist's eyes widened slightly as she found the name on the high-priority meeting list. She buzzed her through with a look of utter bewilderment. The conference room was a lion's den. The entire senior architectural team was there, including Alistair, the lead landscape architect, who looked at her with a mixture of pity and disdain. They were all dressed in their signature, expensive black and gray uniforms, a flock of sleek, urban crows. Flora, in her simple overalls, felt like a sparrow who had wandered into the wrong territory. At the head of the table sat Maxwell Blackwood. His face was an unreadable mask of cold professionalism. He gestured to the front of the room. "The floor is yours, Miss Monroe," he said, his tone leaving no doubt that he expected this to be a quick and painful execution. "Try to be efficient." Flora walked to the front of the room. She didn't use the holographic projector. She unrolled her large hand-drawn sketches and pinned them to the whiteboard. The contrast between her organic watercolor designs and the sterile high-tech room was jarring. A few of the younger architects exchanged amused smirks. "Good morning," she began, her voice quiet but clear, filling the tense silence. "Mr. Blackwood asked me to present my doodle." She looked directly at him, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. "But before I explain the what, I need to talk about the why. You've been trying to design a garden. That is your first mistake. A garden is a place where you impose order on nature. What this building needs is not a garden. It needs a sanctuary." She took a deep breath. "Your current design is built on the principles of control and symmetry. It is mathematically perfect and emotionally bankrupt. It speaks the language of architecture, but it does not speak the language of humanity." She pointed to the official sterile 3D model still sitting in the corner. "That is a space designed to be viewed. This," she said, gesturing to her own sketches, "is a space designed to be felt." For the next 20 minutes, Flora Monroe held the most powerful architects in the city completely captive. She didn't talk about design theory in academic terms. She talked about stories. She talked about the science of biophilia, the innate human need to connect with nature. She explained how the sound of moving water has been scientifically proven to lower cortisol levels and reduce stress. She talked about how irregular, meandering paths encourage mindfulness and exploration, while straight lines encourage rushing. "You want to inspire innovation?" she asked, her voice rising with passion. "Innovation doesn't happen in a straight line. It happens in the messy, unpredictable spaces in between. It happens when an employee can find a quiet bench, hidden by a cluster of ferns, to think. It happens when 2 colleagues have a chance encounter on a winding path and strike up a conversation. You have designed a space for efficiency. I have designed a space for serendipity. She then walked them through her plant selection. You chose plants that are easy to maintain, she said, looking at Alistair. I chose plants that are designed to surprise. The Japanese maple in the center will turn a fiery, brilliant red for 2 weeks every autumn. A sudden, beautiful spectacle. These small, night-blooming jasmine flowers, tucked away near the benches, will be almost invisible during the day, but will fill the evening air with an intoxicating fragrance. You've created a space that is static. I've created a space that is alive, a space that changes with the seasons, with the time of day, a space that has its own story. When she finished, the room was completely silent. The smirks were gone. The architects were staring at her, not with amusement, but with a dawning, stunned respect. She hadn't just presented a design. She had challenged the very foundation of their philosophy. Maxwell was the first to speak. His face was pale, his expression a storm of conflicting emotions. He stood up and walked to the front of the room, examining her watercolor sketches up close. He touched the rough paper, tracing the line of a curved path with his finger. The water feature, he said, his voice a low murmur. The whispering wall. The estimated cost for the custom stonework and the closed-loop pump system would be substantial. Yes, Flora said, her heart pounding. This was it, the moment he would dismiss it all as impractical. And the maintenance for this chaotic, diverse ecosystem of plants would be significantly higher than for a controlled, minimalist design, he continued, his back still to the room. It would, she confirmed, bracing herself. He was silent for a long, agonizing moment. Then he slowly turned around to face his team. Alistair, he said, his voice ringing with a new, unfamiliar authority. Scrap your entire design, all of it. He then turned to look at Flora, and for the first time she saw something in his eyes that wasn't anger or disdain. It was a flicker of profound, unadulterated awe. Miss Monroe, he said, you're hired. You will be leading the Atrium project, effective immediately. You will report directly to me, and your budget, he added, a slow, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips, is unlimited. The collective gasp in the room was audible. Alistair looked as if he had been struck by lightning. Flora just stood there, her hand-drawn sketches pinned to the whiteboard behind her. A small, triumphant sparrow who had just silenced a room full of crows. She had come in expecting to be fired. She was walking out as the most unlikely and most powerful new voice in the world of architecture. The transition from gardener to project lead was like being thrown into the deep end of a very cold, very corporate swimming pool. Flora was given a temporary office, a small, glass-walled cube that felt like a fishbowl, and a team of young, eager architects who were both terrified of Maxwell and thrilled to be working on something that wasn't another gray box. Her first meeting with Maxwell was a lesson in culture shock. She arrived with her notebook and a small, cheerful-looking succulent for her new desk. He arrived with a 30-page contract and a lawyer. This is your employment agreement, he said, pushing the document across the table. It outlines your salary, your responsibilities, and a very strict non-disclosure agreement. Flora looked at the intimidating document, then at him. Does it also mention if I get a lunch break? She asked, her humor her only defense against the overwhelming formality of the situation. He didn't smile. Your salary will be substantial, he said, naming a figure that made her choke on her own breath. In return, I expect results, and I expect you to be available for meetings whenever I deem them necessary. Understood, she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. Their working relationship was a bizarre dance of clashing philosophies. He would demand a detailed, color-coded spreadsheet projecting the growth of the ornamental grasses. She would hand him a hand-drawn sketch showing how the light would hit the leaves at different times of day. He would ask for a cost-benefit analysis of the whispering wall. She would bring him a small desktop water fountain so he could understand the emotional ROI of a soothing sound. He was constantly frustrated by her methods, but he couldn't argue with her vision. She had a deep, intuitive understanding of the space that his years of technical training couldn't replicate. The real challenge was the rest of the company. Alistair and his team of landscape architects were openly hostile. They treated her with a condescending politeness that was more insulting than open anger. They would forget to invite her to crucial meetings. They would question her decisions on technical grounds, trying to trip her up on details of irrigation systems and soil pH levels. Flora, however, was not easily intimidated. She spent her nights in her small apartment, not sleeping, but studying. She read textbooks on horticulture, engineering manuals on water pump systems, and architectural treatises on structural supports. She armed herself with knowledge. In meetings, when they tried to corner her, she would calmly and precisely counter their arguments, not with stories this time, but with their own language of data and facts. She not only defended her choices, she proved they were superior. She was slowly, painstakingly earning their grudging respect. Through it all, Maxwell was a silent, watchful presence. He never intervened in her battles with Alistair's team. He let her fight, he let her prove herself. But she would often look up from her work to see him watching her from his glass-walled office, his expression unreadable. One evening, she was working late, trying to solve a complex problem with the atrium's drainage system. She was exhausted, frustrated, and on the verge of admitting defeat. Her office door opened. It was Maxwell. He was holding 2 cups of coffee. "I thought you might need this," he said, placing one on her desk. "Thank you," she said, surprised. He didn't leave. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her. "Drainage problem?" he asked. "The simulation shows a potential for flooding in the northwest corner during heavy rain," she said, rubbing her temples. "We've tried 3 different solutions. None of them work." He was quiet for a moment. "When I was a kid," he said, his voice surprisingly soft, "my mother had a small garden. She had a problem with a corner that always flooded. She said the earth was too hard, too compacted to drink the water." Flora looked at him, intrigued. "So, she didn't try to add more drains," he continued. "She spent a whole weekend aerating the soil, mixing in sand and compost. She didn't try to get rid of the water, she just gave it a better place to go." Flora stared at him, then at her complex blueprints. A slow smile spread across her face. The solution wasn't in adding more complex pipes. It was in making the soil itself more permeable. It was a simple, elegant, nature-based solution that her team of engineers had completely overlooked. "Your mother was a very smart woman," she said. "She was," he agreed, a rare, nostalgic softness in his eyes. He then looked at her, his professional mask slipping for a moment. "You remind me of her sometimes. You see the world in a different way." The compliment was so unexpected, so personal, that it left her speechless. They stood in the quiet of her small office, the scent of coffee mingling with the smell of blueprints. And for the first time, the vast, intimidating space between the billionaire architect and the humble gardener felt a little bit smaller. The shared moment over the drainage problem was like a crack in the thick, icy wall between them. In the days that followed, Flora noticed a subtle but undeniable shift in Maxwell. He started seeking out her opinion, not just on the atrium, but on other projects. He'd call her into his office, unroll a set of blueprints for a new residential tower, and ask, "What's the story here, Monroe? What does this building feel like?" At first she was hesitant, intimidated by the scale of his work, but she soon realized he was genuinely asking. He wasn't testing her, he was consulting her. She would look at his clean, perfect lines and suggest adding a small, unexpected pocket park, a communal rooftop garden, or a facade that incorporated living, not breathing greenery. She was teaching him to design not just for the eye, but for the soul. "You're a chaos agent," he told her one afternoon, a strange mix of frustration and admiration in his voice as he looked at the changes she had proposed for a new library design. "You've taken my perfectly ordered symphony of right angles and introduced jazz." "Jazz is good for the soul, Mr. Blackwood," she replied with a grin. "It reminds us that not everything beautiful has to follow a predictable rhythm." He started calling her Flora. A small change that felt monumental. And she, in turn, found the courage to start calling him Maxwell. Their late-night work sessions became less about problems and more about possibilities. They would argue passionately about the merits of different types of stone, and then find themselves, an hour later, talking about their favorite books or the most beautiful places they had ever seen. He was discovering the woman behind the gardener, a voracious reader, a lover of old maps, and a fiercely loyal friend. She was discovering the man behind the architect, a lonely soul with a surprising dry wit, a deep-seated integrity, and a hidden passion for building intricate ship models, a hobby he hadn't touched in years. This growing closeness, however, was not happening in a vacuum. It was a beacon of light that cast long, dark shadows, and those shadows had a name: Alistair. Alistair, the lead landscape architect whom Flora had effectively replaced, saw their partnership not as a collaboration, but as a hostile takeover of his territory and, more importantly, of his boss's attention. He had been Maxwell's protégé for years, the heir apparent to the firm's sterile, minimalist aesthetic. Flora's success was a direct repudiation of everything he stood for. His professional jealousy curdled into a bitter, personal resentment. He began a quiet campaign of sabotage. It was subtle, cowardly, and designed to make Flora look incompetent. He would accidentally submit the wrong soil analysis report to a vendor, causing a week-long delay in a crucial delivery of trees. He would misinterpret her instructions for the irrigation system layout, forcing her to spend days correcting the work of his team. Flora knew exactly what he was doing. She didn't complain to Maxwell. She handled it. She worked longer hours, double-checking every order, documenting every instruction in writing, and preempting Alistair's attempts at sabotage with a quiet, relentless competence. It was exhausting, a silent, draining war fought in the trenches of emails and supply manifests. Maxwell was not blind. He saw the accidents and the misinterpretations. He saw the exhaustion in Flora's eyes. The old Maxwell would have fired Alistair on the spot, a swift, brutal execution. But the new Maxwell, the one who was learning from Flora, knew that wasn't the answer. Firing Alistair would make Flora look like she needed him to fight her battles. It would confirm every ugly whisper that she was a boss's favorite who couldn't handle the pressure. He had to trust her to win this on her own. But he also knew he had to let her know she wasn't alone. One evening, he found her in the now darkened main office, the only one left, her head in her hands as she stared at a complex plumbing schematic. He switched the pipe specifications again, didn't he? Maxwell asked, his voice quiet. Flora looked up, startled. How did you know? Because it's a classic Alistair move, he said, pulling up a chair beside her. Create a problem that is technically someone else's fault, but that only you will have to work all night to fix. He looked at her, his eyes full of a concern that was deeply personal. You don't have to do this alone, Flora. Yes, I do, she said, her voice laced with a weary determination. If I run to you every time he tries something, I'll never earn their respect. They'll always see me as the gardener who got lucky. Respect is not something you should have to earn from a man like Alistair, he said, his voice hardening. It should be a given. In your world, maybe, she countered. In mine, you fight for every inch of it. She looked at him, a tired but grateful smile on her face. But thank you for seeing it. That helps, more than you know. He stayed with her for the next 3 hours. He didn't offer solutions. He just sat with her, a quiet, supportive presence, while she methodically worked through the problem. He made her coffee. He ordered them pizza, which they ate out of the box on top of a stack of million-dollar blueprints. And in that quiet, shared moment of late-night work and cheap pizza, their partnership solidified into something that felt unbreakable. The final confrontation with Alistair came a week later, and it was not of Flora's making. The client, the tech giant for whom the building was being constructed, had scheduled a surprise site visit with their CEO, a notoriously demanding woman named Evelyn Reed. Flora was ready. The atrium was a beautiful work in progress. The foundational work was done, the meandering paths were laid out, and the first of the large, mature trees had been craned into place. The tour was going perfectly. Evelyn Reed was clearly impressed. It feels different than the renderings, she said, her voice full of a rare approval. It has a pulse. They were standing near the site of the future Whispering Wall when Alistair saw his chance. Of course, he said, stepping forward with a smooth, practiced smile. We've had to make a few practical adjustments to Ms. Monroe's original, more artistic vision. He unrolled a blueprint, a version Flora had never seen before. For example, the water wall. The original design was beautiful, but a potential maintenance nightmare. We've streamlined it, replacing the natural moss with a more durable, synthetic composite and simplifying the pump system. It will give the same aesthetic effect, with a fraction of the operational cost. Flora stared at him, her blood running cold. He was lying. He had taken her design and stripped it of its soul, presenting this sterile, cost-cut version as an improvement. Evelyn Reed frowned, looking at the new blueprint. A synthetic composite? It sounds artificial. It's state-of-the-art, Alistair insisted, visually indistinguishable from the real thing. This was the moment. Flora could feel Maxwell's eyes on her. She knew he would back her up if she challenged Alistair, but she also knew she had to do this herself. She took a deep breath. "With all due respect, Mr. Alistair," she said, her voice clear and strong, "that is not a practical adjustment. That is a fundamental betrayal of the project's entire philosophy." The entire group went silent, turning to look at her. "Miss Reed," Flora continued, turning to the CEO, "you didn't hire Blackwood Designs to build you another sterile glass box. You hired them to build a landmark, a building that would foster creativity and well-being. The soul of that vision is authenticity. A synthetic wall will not give the same aesthetic effect because the effect is not just visual. It's about the feel of the cool, damp stone. It's about the subtle, earthy scent of real moss. It's about creating a living, breathing space, not a perfect, dead replica." She looked directly at Alistair, her eyes blazing. "You can't cut costs on a soul, sir, and if you think you can, then you have fundamentally misunderstood the very nature of this project." Evelyn Reed was silent for a long, tense moment. She looked from Flora's passionate, flushed face to Alistair's suddenly pale one. Then she looked at Maxwell. "She's right," the CEO said finally. "The synthetic wall is out. We proceed with the original, authentic design. No more practical adjustments." She then turned to Flora, a slow, appreciative smile spreading across her face. "Miss Monroe," she said, "I like your style. When this project is finished, I'd like to talk to you about designing the new gardens at our corporate campus in California." It was a checkmate. In front of the entire senior team and their most important client, Alistair had been publicly and completely defeated, not by a rival architect, but by the quiet gardener he had tried so hard to crush. He mumbled an excuse and retreated, his face a mask of humiliated fury. After the tour, as the clients were leaving, Maxwell walked over to Flora. He didn't say anything, he just looked at her, his eyes full of a pride and admiration so profound it made her heart ache. "You didn't need me," he said, his voice a low murmur. "No," she said, a triumphant smile on her face, "I didn't. But I was here," he added, "just in case." "I know," she said, her smile softening. And that made all the difference. He reached out and, in a gesture that felt both incredibly brave and perfectly natural, he took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. He didn't care who was watching. The silent war was over. And they had won. Not just the battle over the atrium, but a much bigger, more important one. Holding hands in the aftermath of a corporate battle was one thing. Figuring out how to do it on a regular Tuesday was another thing entirely. The victory over Alistair didn't magically erase the invisible, shimmering wall between Maxwell and Flora's two worlds. It just gave them a door. Walking through it, however, proved to be a masterclass in awkward, heartfelt, and often hilarious navigation. Their first official date was Maxwell's attempt to enter her world. "You choose," he had said, a brave but foolish offer from a man whose idea of a good time was a silent evening with a biography of a dead industrialist. Flora, true to form, did not choose a quiet, romantic restaurant. She chose the annual Monroe family reunion and potluck picnic. "You want me to meet your entire extended family? All at once?" Maxwell had asked, his voice a full octave higher than usual. "As our first date?" "It's not a date, it's a trial by fire," she had said with a grin. "If you can survive my Aunt Sophia's 7-layer dip and my Uncle Hector's conspiracy theories about squirrels, you can survive anything." And so, the following Saturday, Maxwell Blackwood, the god of geometry, found himself in a chaotic, sprawling public park, wearing a pair of new, stiff jeans he had his assistant buy, and holding a ridiculously expensive bottle of French wine that looked completely out of place next to the bowls of potato salad and Jell-O molds. He was a shark in a waiting pool of cheerful, friendly goldfish. Flora's family was a loud, loving, and overwhelming force of nature. They didn't shake his hand, they hugged him. They didn't ask what he did for a living. They asked if he knew how to play soccer. Her grandmother, a tiny woman with eyes as sharp as Flora's, had taken one look at him, patted his cheek, and declared in Spanish, "He is too tall and too serious, but he has good eyes. We can work with him." He spent the afternoon being utterly, completely out of his depth. He was roped into a fiercely competitive three-legged race with Flora's 7-year-old cousin, a tiny, ruthless competitor named Leo. They came in last place, mostly because Maxwell's legs did not seem to understand the concept of in sync. He was subjected to a long, passionate lecture by Uncle Hector about how squirrels were secretly plotting to take over the city's power grid, and he ate a piece of Aunt Sophia's 7-layer dip, a dish so dense and powerful he was sure it could be used as a building material. Through it all, he watched Flora. He saw her not as the brilliant project lead or the defiant gardener, but as a daughter, a niece, a cousin, a granddaughter. He saw her laughing with her aunts, playing with the children, listening to her grandmother's stories with a look of pure, unconditional love. He saw the roots of her strength, the source of her unshakable humanity, and he fell in love with her all over again, in a deeper, more profound way. At the end of the day, as they were helping to pack up the picnic blankets, Flora's grandmother pulled him aside. "You love my Flora," she said, not as a question, but as a statement. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice full of a respect she had instantly commanded. "I do." "Good," she said, her eyes twinkling. "She is a wild garden, not a perfect lawn. You cannot control her. You can only give her good soil and plenty of sunshine. You understand?" "I'm beginning to," he said, and he meant it. On the drive home, the car was filled with a comfortable, happy silence. "So," Flora said, finally breaking it, "on a scale of 1 to being audited by the IRS, how traumatic was that?" He looked at her, at the smudge of ketchup on her cheek and the happy exhaustion in her eyes, and a genuine, unforced smile spread across his face. "It was the best day I've had in a very long time," he said. And it was the truth. Their next date was Flora's attempt to enter his world. He had invited her to the annual Architects Guild Ball, a formal black-tie event filled with his peers, his rivals, and his mentors. "Now it's my turn to be the goldfish in the shark tank," she had said nervously, as she looked at the simple but elegant gown he had helped her pick out. "You're not a goldfish," he had told her, his hands gently on her shoulders. "You're the ocean. They're just swimming in it." He had never seen her look so beautiful. She moved through the stuffy, pretentious crowd with a quiet grace that was more captivating than any of the flashy designer gowns in the room. She didn't try to talk about architectural theory. She just talked to people. She asked them about their first projects, about the buildings they had dreamed of designing as children. She found the human stories hidden behind their professional facades. She spent 20 minutes talking to the oldest, most revered architect in the city, not about his iconic skyscrapers, but about the small, beautiful garden he had designed for his late wife. The old man, who was notoriously grumpy, was moved to tears. By the end of the night, a circle of the city's most brilliant architectural minds had gathered around her, not to talk about work, but just to listen to her. Maxwell watched, his heart swelling with a pride so fierce it almost hurt. She wasn't just holding her own in his world, she was making it better. Later, as they were dancing, he pulled her closer. "You know," he whispered in her ear, "my grandmother was right." "About what?" "You are a wild garden," he said, his voice a low murmur. "And you are the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." She rested her head on his shoulder, the sounds of the orchestra and the polite chatter of the crowd fading into a distant hum. In that moment, they weren't the billionaire architect and the humble gardener. They were just Maxwell and Flora, two people from different worlds who had found in each other a shared and beautiful home. Their relationship, once it was finally allowed to breathe, was a thing of simple, profound joy. They were inseparable. They spent their weekends working on the atrium, their hands covered in dirt, laughing as they planted the night-blooming jasmine together. They spent their evenings in his vast, silent library, which was now filled with her favorite books and the soft sound of her reading poetry aloud to him. He had never been happier. The walls around his heart, which he had thought were made of impenetrable stone, had been completely, joyfully overgrown by the wild, beautiful garden of his love for her. But the real world, with its contracts and its complications, had one more test for them. The call came on a Wednesday morning. It was from Evelyn Reed, the CEO of the tech giant. "Maxwell," she said, her voice sharp and urgent. "We have a problem. A big one." The city's notoriously difficult Historical Preservation Committee had filed a last-minute injunction against the Atrium project. A newly discovered historical society, a group no one had ever heard of, was claiming that the site of the new tower was of significant historical importance and that all construction must be halted immediately, pending a multi-year review. "It's a shakedown, Evelyn," Maxwell said, his mind already racing. "It's a ghost organization, probably created by a rival trying to sabotage the project. We'll fight it. We'll win." "We don't have time to fight it," Evelyn said, her voice grim. "We have a launch date. Every day of delay costs us millions. The board is getting cold feet. They're talking about pulling the plug on the entire atrium. They're saying it's too much of a liability." Maxwell felt a cold dread wash over him. The atrium wasn't just a part of the project anymore. It was his and Flora's sanctuary, the physical manifestation of their story. Losing it would be like losing a part of himself. "Find out who is behind this," he commanded his legal team. "I want a name." The name came back an hour later, and it hit him like a physical blow. The sole funder and founder of the new Seattle Historical Society was Alistair. He had not just been defeated, he had been humiliated. And now, he was coming for his revenge. He wasn't attacking Maxwell's company. He was attacking his heart. He was trying to destroy the one thing he knew mattered most to him, the beautiful, wild, and sacred space he was building with Flora. "What are we going to do?" Flora asked, her face pale as she looked at the legal documents. Maxwell looked at her, at the fear in her eyes, and he felt the last vestiges of the old, cold Maxwell fall away, replaced by the fierce, protective instinct of a man in love. "We're going to fight," he said, his voice a low, steady promise. "He wants to fight us on historical grounds? Fine. He has no idea who he's up against. He's just brought a legal battle. You, my love," he said, taking her hand, "you are bringing the entire, beautiful, messy, and undeniable weight of history itself." Alistair's attack was a masterstroke of corporate warfare, cloaked in the noble guise of historical preservation. The injunction was a legal labyrinth, a tangle of obscure bylaws and bureaucratic red tape designed to bleed them dry, both in time and in spirit. The weekly project meetings, once filled with the excited energy of creation, were now tense, somber affairs dominated by lawyers and talk of depositions and discovery motions. The beautiful, vibrant dream of the atrium was being suffocated by the gray dust of legal procedure. Maxwell watched, his frustration mounting, as his high-powered legal team, a group of the sharpest minds in the city, repeatedly hit a wall. Alistair had been clever. He had found a genuine, albeit minor, historical footnote related to the land. A small, long-forgotten trading post had existed on the site in the late 19th century, and had inflated it into a matter of monumental historical significance. "He's using the law as a weapon of attrition," Maxwell growled in one of their late-night strategy sessions at his penthouse. "He knows he can't win on the merits, but he's hoping to delay us long enough for the client to give up. He's not trying to win a case, he's trying to win a war of nerves." Flora, who had been quietly reading through a mountain of historical documents she had unearthed from the city archives, looked up. "Then, we need to stop fighting his war," she said, her voice calm and clear. "We need to fight ours." "What do you mean?" Maxwell asked. "Your lawyers are trying to fight him on legal technicalities," she explained, pushing aside a stack of legal briefs and unrolling a large, hand-drawn map of 19th century Seattle. "They're fighting his facts with your facts. But Alistair isn't interested in facts. He's interested in a narrative. The narrative of the greedy corporation destroying a piece of local history. We can't win by arguing the law. We have to win by telling a better story." For the next week, their penthouse was transformed into a historical detective agency. While Maxwell's legal team prepared for the upcoming hearing, Flora and a small, dedicated team of researchers she had hired from the local university went on a deep dive into the history of the site. They spent their days in dusty city archives, poring over old maps, property deeds, and forgotten newspaper articles. They spent their evenings in Maxwell's library, piecing together the puzzle. Maxwell, for the first time in his life, took a step back from a corporate battle. He trusted her. He became her logistical support, ensuring she had whatever she needed: unlimited access to research databases, funding for her team, and a constant supply of strong coffee and her favorite pastries. He watched, fascinated, as she worked. She was not just a researcher. She was a historical archaeologist, digging through the layers of the past to find the truth. The breakthrough came late one Thursday night. Flora was examining a series of old faded photographs of the original trading post when she noticed something. A small, almost insignificant detail in the background of one of the photos. A sign, written in a language she didn't recognize. "Maxwell," she called out, her voice full of an excited energy. "Come look at this." He rushed over, looking at the magnified image on her screen. "What is it? I can't read that." "I know," she said, her eyes shining, "but I have a friend at the university's linguistics department who might be able to." The translation came back the next morning, and it was the key that unlocked the entire case. The sign was not in a European language. It was in Lushootseed, the language of the Duwamish tribe, the original inhabitants of the Seattle area. The sign read, "The Place of Whispering Reeds." The trading post wasn't the first thing on that land, Flora explained to Maxwell, her voice full of a quiet reverence. It was built on a site that was already sacred to the Duwamish people. It was a place of gathering, of storytelling. This was it, their better story. Alistair was fighting to preserve the history of a minor colonial trading post. They were fighting to honor a history that was far deeper, older, and more significant. The day of the preliminary hearing arrived. The courtroom was packed. Alistair was there with his legal team, looking smug and confident. He presented his case, painting a picture of a soulless corporation trampling on the city's heritage. Then, it was their turn. Maxwell's lawyer stood up to present their legal arguments. But then he did something unexpected. "Your Honor," he said, "before we proceed, my client would like to call a special consultant to the stand to provide some historical context. We call Miss Flora Monroe." A murmur went through the courtroom. Alistair's confident smile faltered. Flora walked to the stand. She was not dressed as a corporate executive. She was in a simple, respectful dress, and in her hands she held not a legal brief, but a single, old photograph. She wasn't sworn in as an expert witness. She was introduced as a community historian. She didn't argue legal points. She told a story. She told the story of the Duwamish people, of the Place of Whispering Reeds. She spoke of their connection to the land, of the stories and the history that existed long before the first settlers arrived. "Alistair," she said, looking directly at her old rival, her voice full of a power that had nothing to do with her corporate title, "is fighting to preserve a building. We are fighting to honor a history. The history of this land is not just about a few colonial traders. It's about the generations of people who were here first, whose stories have been silenced for too long." Then she unveiled their new plan. "We are not asking the court to dismiss this injunction," she announced, to the shock of everyone in the room, including Maxwell's own lawyers. "We are asking the court to support a new vision. We have been in consultation with the leaders of the Duwamish Tribal Council, and we are proposing a new design for the atrium." She presented a new set of renderings. The design was breathtaking. It was a fusion of modern architecture and traditional native art. The Whispering Wall was still there, but now it was a living history, with the story of the Duwamish people carved into the stone. The plantings were not just beautiful. They were a curated collection of native plants, each with its own story and cultural significance. The atrium would not just be a public garden, it would be a permanent, living museum dedicated to the region's indigenous history, with educational programs developed and run in partnership with the Duwamish tribe. History should not be a weapon to stop progress. Flora concluded, her voice ringing with passion. It should be a foundation upon which we build a better, more inclusive future. That is the story we want to build, and we invite Alistair and his historical society to be a part of it. The courtroom was silent. Then a single person in the back started to clap. It was one of the Duwamish tribal elders who had come to watch. Then another person clapped, and another, until the entire room, including the judge, was giving her a standing ovation. Alistair sat at his table, utterly and completely defeated. He had come to fight a legal battle, and she had transformed it into a moral one. He had tried to weaponize history, and she had turned it into a bridge. He hadn't just lost the case, he had lost the entire narrative. After the hearing, as they were leaving the courthouse, they were met by a crowd of reporters. But they weren't asking about the injunction, they were asking about the new vision for the atrium. The story of the corporate giant partnering with the local tribe to honor the land's history was an instant sensation. Maxwell let Flora handle the questions. He stood back, watching her, a look of profound love and admiration on his face. She was not just the woman he loved. She was a force of nature, a woman who could change the world with a single, well-told story. That night, they didn't go out to a fancy restaurant to celebrate. They went back to his penthouse, which now felt unequivocally like their home. They sat on the floor of the living room, eating takeout from their favorite Thai place, the chaos of legal documents and historical maps still spread around them. "You were a giant today," he said, his voice full of awe. "No," she said, taking a bite of her noodles. "I just stood on the shoulders of giants, the ones whose stories were almost forgotten." She looked at him, her expression soft and serious. "Thank you for trusting me, for letting me do it my way." "Flora," he said, taking her hand, "I will trust you with my company, with my future, with my whole life. There is no part of my world that isn't better with you in it." He pulled her closer, and in the quiet of their home, surrounded by the beautiful, chaotic mess of their shared work and their shared life, he kissed her. It was a kiss of deep, profound partnership. They had faced their first real war as a couple, and they had won. Not by being ruthless, but by being true to the story they wanted to create together. And they both knew, with a certainty that was as solid as the city's foundations, that this was just the beginning. The courtroom victory was a seismic event, not just for the Atrium project, but for the entire city. The story of Blackwood Design's unprecedented partnership with the Duwamish tribe became a national headline, a rare and hopeful narrative of corporate conscience. Maxwell, once known as the cold god of geometry, was suddenly being hailed as a visionary, a leader who was redefining the relationship between urban development and cultural heritage. He found the praise deeply uncomfortable. "They're calling me a hero," he grumbled to Flora one morning as he read an article about himself in the Wall Street Journal. "I'm not a hero. I'm just a man who was finally smart enough to listen to the smartest person he knows." Flora, who was sketching a new design for a bench that incorporated traditional tribal carvings, looked up and smiled. "Well, for the record," she said, "I think you're a hero. Not because you wrote a check, but because you were willing to change your own story. That's the hardest kind of architecture there is." Their life, both professional and personal, was now completely intertwined. The Atrium project became their shared passion, a beautiful, complex tapestry they were weaving together. The design process was unlike anything the firm had ever seen. Their conference room, once a sterile space of holographic models and laser pointers, was now a vibrant, collaborative hub. Duwamish elders would come to share stories, their voices filling the room with the ancient history of the land. Tribal artists worked alongside Maxwell's architects, translating traditional patterns into modern design elements. Maxwell, the man who once worshipped the straight line, was now learning the language of curves, of nature, of stories. He found a deep, unexpected joy in the process. He was not just building a structure, he was participating in an act of healing, of reconciliation. He was helping to give a voice to a history that had been silenced for too long. Flora was the heart of it all. She was the bridge, the translator, the one who could speak the language of both the corporate boardroom and the tribal council. She moved between these two worlds with an easy, natural grace, earning the deep respect of both. Alistair, in the wake of his public humiliation, had quietly resigned from the firm. But in a move that surprised everyone, especially Maxwell, Flora had reached out to him. She had invited him to a private meeting, not in an office, but at the city's historical museum. "I don't understand why you wanted to see me," Alistair said, his voice stiff and defensive. "Because I think you love history as much as I do," Flora said simply. "You just started using it as a weapon instead of a map." She then offered him a position, not at Blackwood Designs, but as a volunteer consultant on the new educational programs for the atrium, working with the tribal historians. "Your knowledge of the city's colonial history is valuable," she said. "It's part of the story, too. A complicated part. We need someone who understands it to help us tell the whole honest truth." It was an act of incredible grace, an offer not of forgiveness, but of a path to redemption. Alistair, humbled and disarmed by her generosity, had accepted. Watching her, Maxwell felt a love so profound it was almost overwhelming. She wasn't just building a garden, she was rebuilding people. As the atrium began to take physical shape, their personal relationship settled into a comfortable, beautiful rhythm. They were a team in every sense of the word. They would spend their days in intense design meetings, and their evenings at his penthouse, which now felt like their home. Cooking dinner together, reading side by side in the quiet of his library, or just talking for hours. He learned the small, intimate details of her life. He learned that she was a surprisingly ruthless Scrabble player. He learned that she had a terrible singing voice, but would sing loudly and joyfully in the car anyway. He learned that her greatest fear was not failure, but insignificance. She, in turn, learned the hidden corners of his soul. She learned that his cold, reserved exterior was a shield for a deep, almost painful sensitivity. She learned that he had a secret passion for old black-and-white comedies, and that his laugh, when he truly let it go, was a deep, wonderful, rumbling sound. One rainy Saturday, they were at her small apartment, a place she had decided to keep as her own private sanctuary. He was helping her build a ridiculously complicated bookshelf she had bought. He, the master architect, was completely baffled by the vague, cartoonish instructions. "This is impossible," he declared, after trying for the third time to fit tab A into slot B. "The structural integrity is a joke. This thing is a lawsuit waiting to happen." Flora, who was sitting on the floor, laughing at him, took the instructions. "You're thinking like an architect," she said. "You have to think like a confused person who just wants a place to put their books." She pointed to the diagram. "See? You're not supposed to use the long screws there. You're supposed to use the weird L-shaped ones." He looked at the diagram, then at the screws, then at her. "That makes absolutely no sense." "I know," she said with a grin. "Welcome to the beautiful, illogical chaos of the real world." He shook his head, but he was smiling. He followed her nonsensical instructions, and 10 minutes later, they had a wobbly but functional bookshelf. He stood back, looking at their creation, a feeling of deep, simple satisfaction washing over him. He had built skyscrapers that had won international awards, but in that moment, this crooked, cheap bookshelf felt like his greatest architectural achievement. He looked at her, at the smudge of sawdust on her nose and the joyful triumph in her eyes, and he knew, with a certainty that was as solid and as real as the floor beneath his feet, that he could not live without this woman. "Flora," he said, his voice suddenly serious. "What is it?" she asked, looking up from arranging her books on the new shelf. He walked over to her, taking the book from her hands and setting it aside. He took her hands in his gaze intense. "I've been thinking about what you said, about how innovation doesn't happen in a straight line, about how the most beautiful things are often a little bit messy." She looked at him, her heart starting to beat a little faster. "My life," he continued, his voice a low, intimate murmur, "has been a straight line, a perfect, predictable, and incredibly lonely straight line. You are the most beautiful, chaotic, wonderful curve I have ever encountered. You've taken my perfect, sterile blueprint and you've filled it with life, with stories, with a joy I didn't even know was possible." He took a deep breath, his heart in his eyes. "I don't just want you to be the project lead in my company. I want you to be the project lead of my life. I don't want to just build a sanctuary in a building. I want to build a sanctuary with you, for us." He slowly got down on one knee, right there on the floor of her small, book-filled apartment. He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. He opened it. Inside was not a massive, perfect diamond. It was a unique, antique ring, a band of woven gold designed to look like a vine, with a single, small, brilliant green emerald, the color of a new leaf, nestled in the center. "I found it in a little antique shop you love," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The owner told me it was a promise ring from the 1920s. a promise of new growth, of a love that is alive and always changing. He looked up at her, his entire soul in his gaze. "Flora Monroe," he said, "you are my new growth, my new life. Will you do me the incredible honor of marrying me?" She was crying, silent, happy tears streaming down her face. She couldn't speak. She just nodded, a series of frantic, joyful nods. He slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. He stood up, and she launched herself into his arms, burying her face in his chest. He held her tight, a feeling of profound, unshakable peace settling over him. The god of geometry had finally learned to embrace the curve, and it was more beautiful than anything he had ever designed. The engagement of Maxwell Blackwood and Flora Monroe was not announced in the society pages of a glossy magazine. It was announced in a small, heartfelt post on the community blog of the Duwamish tribe, alongside a picture of the two of them, hands covered in dirt, planting the first sacred cedar sapling in the atrium's foundation. The headline was simple: "Building a future, honoring a past." It was a statement, a declaration that their union was not just a personal affair, but a partnership rooted in a shared purpose. Planning the wedding became their next and most joyful collaborative project. Maxwell, ever the architect, wanted to handle the logistics. Flora, ever the storyteller, wanted to handle the soul. They found their perfect compromise, a beautiful, harmonious design that was a reflection of their own relationship. They chose not to marry in a grand ballroom or a stuffy country club. They chose the atrium itself. The construction was not yet complete, but the main structure was in place, the glass dome soaring above them like a cathedral ceiling. The space was raw, unfinished, full of the promise of what it was to become, a perfect metaphor for their own love story. The guest list was a chaotic, wonderful mix of their two lives. Flora's sprawling, loving family from the potluck picnic mingled with Maxwell's once stiff colleagues, who were now learning to appreciate the value of a good story and a good 7-layer dip. The elders and artists of the Duwamish tribe were the guests of honor, their presence lending a deep, profound sense of history and blessing to the occasion. Even Alistair was there, looking humbled and genuinely happy, having found a new sense of purpose in his work with the foundation. Flora's dress was a masterpiece of her own design philosophy. She had worked with a young, local designer to create a gown that incorporated elements of nature. The fabric was a soft, flowing silk, the color of a pale wildflower, and delicate, hand-embroidered green vines, mirroring the design of her engagement ring, crept up the sleeves and along the hem. In her hair she wore not a diamond tiara, but a simple crown of fresh lavender and baby's breath. Maxwell waited for her at the base of the Whispering Wall, which was now a stunning, completed cascade of moss-covered stone and trickling water. He wore a classic, impeccably tailored suit, but in his pocket square, peeking out, was a single, cheerful yellow daisy, a nod to the day he had first seen her sketching in the park. As she walked down the makeshift aisle of soft green turf that had been laid for the occasion, a hush fell over the crowd. She was a vision of natural, effortless beauty, a garden goddess in the heart of a steel and glass city. Maxwell looked at her, his heart so full he felt it might burst. He had designed buildings that had won every award imaginable, but he knew, with a certainty that was absolute, that this woman was, and always would be, his most breathtaking creation. Their vows were spoken not over the sound of a formal organ, but over the gentle, soothing murmur of the Whispering Wall. They didn't speak of mergers or legacies in the corporate sense. They spoke of the legacies of the heart. "Maxwell," Flora began, her voice clear and strong, resonating in the vast open space. "You came into my life as a man of straight lines, of perfect angles, of a world that could be measured and controlled. I came into yours as a chaotic curve, a messy doodle, a believer in the beauty of things that are a little bit wild." She smiled, her eyes shining. "You taught me that my dreams were not too big, that my voice was worthy of being heard in the most powerful of rooms. You gave my wild garden a place to grow." She squeezed his hands. "I promise to always be the chaos to your order, the curve to your straight line. I promise to fill our life with messy, beautiful, and unpredictable stories. And I promise to always see the sanctuary in your soul. I love you." When it was Maxwell's turn, his voice was thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Flora," he said, his gaze locked on hers. My world was a perfect, sterile blueprint, a masterpiece of design that was completely empty of life. You are the sunlight, the rain, the wild seed that I didn't even know my world was starving for. You didn't just design a garden in my building, you planted one in my heart. He took a deep breath. You taught me that a home is not built with steel and glass, but with laughter, with trust, and with a shared history. You are my history, my present, and my entire future. I promise to be the good soil and the constant sunshine that your beautiful wild garden deserves. I love you now and for all the chapters to come. Their first kiss as husband and wife was met with a chorus of joyful cheers, whistles, and the sound of traditional Duwamish drums, a powerful, rhythmic heartbeat that seemed to bless their union. The reception was a celebration of everything they had built together. The food was a fusion of haute cuisine and the simple, delicious dishes from Flora's family picnics. The music was a mix of a classical string quartet and a vibrant tribal drum circle. Guests sat at long communal tables made of reclaimed wood, and in the center of each table was not a formal flower arrangement, but a small living sapling that guests would later be invited to plant in the atrium's soil. It was a wedding that broke all the rules, and it was absolutely perfect. Later in the evening, as the party was in full swing, Flora found her new father-in-law, Arthur Blackwood, standing alone, looking at one of her original watercolor renderings of the atrium, which had been framed and given a place of honor. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "What you've created here, what you've created in him." "He did most of the work himself," Flora replied softly. "He just needed someone to show him where the door was." Arthur was quiet for a moment. "His mother," he said, his voice a little hoarse, "she would have adored you." It was the closest he had ever come to giving his blessing, and it meant the world to her. Their life after the wedding was not a quiet settling down, but a joyful blooming. The atrium, when it was finally completed and open to the public, was a triumph. It was more than just a garden. It was a living, breathing heart in the center of the city. A place where business executives and tired tourists and local families could all find a moment of peace. It became a beloved city landmark and a powerful symbol of their partnership. They didn't live in Maxwell's cold, minimalist penthouse. They bought a sprawling, slightly ramshackle old house with a huge, overgrown garden on the outskirts of the city. He, the master architect, spent his weekends joyfully designing renovations. She, the master gardener, spent her days covered in dirt, taming the wild, chaotic land and turning it into a paradise of mismatched flowers and hidden pathways. They filled the house with life, with books, with art, with the laughter of Flora's countless cousins, and eventually with the sound of their own children. They had a son, with his father's thoughtful gray eyes and his mother's wild, curly hair, and a daughter, with her mother's serene smile and her father's stubborn, determined chin. Maxwell and Flora never stopped being who they were. He was still the brilliant, logical architect. She was still the intuitive, story-driven gardener. But they had learned to build together, to create a life that was a perfect, beautiful fusion of their two worlds. One cool summer evening, many years later, they were sitting on the porch of their home, watching their own children and a collection of neighborhood kids play a chaotic game of soccer in the backyard. "You know," Maxwell said, taking her hand, "your grandmother was wrong about one thing." "Oh, what's that?" Flora asked, leaning her head on his shoulder. "She said I couldn't control a wild garden," he said, a slow, happy smile on his face. "But she was wrong. I just had to realize that the point wasn't to control it. The point was to let it grow, and to be grateful that I get to live in it." She smiled, her heart full. "That's a pretty good story, Mr. Blackwood." "It's our story," he said, pulling her closer, "and it's my favorite one." He kissed her, a deep, comfortable, lived-in kiss, full of the shared history of a love that had been planted in the most unlikely of places and had bloomed into something more beautiful than either of them could have ever designed on their own. The sound of their children's laughter was the perfect, chaotic, and utterly perfect soundtrack to their happily ever after. Years melted into a beautiful, seamless tapestry of a life well lived. The firm, Blackwood Designs, under Maxwell's new, more human-centric philosophy, became not just the most successful architectural firm in the country, but also the most innovative. They became known for creating spaces that were not just visually stunning, but emotionally resonant, buildings that had a soul. And in every project, Flora was his silent, brilliant partner. The one who would look at a sterile blueprint and ask the one question that changed everything. But how does it make you feel? The atrium, their first and most personal collaboration, became a beloved city landmark. It was a place of first dates, of quiet lunchtime meditations, of school trips where children learned about the deep, rich history of their land. It was a living testament to the idea that progress and preservation could and should walk hand in hand. Their own wild garden at their country home became a local legend. Flora, with her boundless energy and green thumb, had transformed the overgrown land into a breathtaking paradise. It was not a perfect, manicured garden, but a joyful, chaotic explosion of life, with hidden nooks, winding paths, and a riot of mismatched flowers that bloomed in a constant, year-round celebration of color. Once a year, they would open the garden to the public for a storytelling festival, an event that brought together people from all walks of life to share stories, music, and food. Their children, a son named Oliver and a daughter named Lily, grew up with dirt under their fingernails and blueprints on their kitchen table. They inherited their father's keen eye for structure and their mother's deep love for stories, a potent and beautiful combination. Oliver would build magnificent, structurally sound treehouses, while Lily would populate them with intricate, character-driven narratives of the brave squirrels and heroic robins who lived there. Maxwell and Flora grew older together, their love deepening with each passing year. It was a comfortable, lived-in love, a partnership built on a foundation of mutual respect, shared laughter, and an unshakable trust. He was still the calm, logical anchor. She was still the joyful, chaotic wind in their sails. And together, they navigated the beautiful, unpredictable waters of life. One crisp autumn afternoon, when they were both in their late 60s, they were sitting on a bench in the atrium, watching their grandchildren chase fallen leaves. The Japanese maple that Flora had insisted on planting all those years ago was in its full, fiery glory, a breathtaking spectacle of red and gold. "You know," Maxwell said, taking her hand, his own now weathered and wrinkled, but his grip as strong as ever, "I was thinking about the day we met." Flora smiled, her face a beautiful map of a life full of laughter. "You mean the day you laughed at my childish scribble and threatened to end my career?" "That's the one," he said, a twinkle in his eye. "I was an arrogant fool." "You were," she agreed cheerfully, "but you were a fool with potential." They sat in a comfortable silence for a moment, watching their grandchildren's joyful play. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, his voice suddenly serious. "Leaving your own quiet life behind? Being pulled into my chaotic, high-pressure world?" She turned to him, her gaze clear and full of a love that had stood the test of time. "Maxwell Blackwood," she said, her voice soft but firm. "My life was never quiet. It was just waiting for the right kind of beautiful noise. You and our children and our grandchildren, you are the most beautiful noise I have ever known." He leaned over and kissed her, a slow, sweet kiss that was full of a lifetime of shared memories. The story of the billionaire architect and the humble gardener had become a legend, a favorite tale told in the city. But for them, it was simply their life. A life that proved that the most beautiful structures are not built with steel and glass, but with courage, with trust, and with a love that is brave enough to let a wild garden grow. And they both knew, as they sat hand in hand, surrounded by the legacy of the sanctuary they had built together, that theirs was a story with no final chapter, a love that would continue to grow, to change, and to bloom, for all the seasons to come. We'd like to take a moment to give a very special thank you and a warm welcome to some of our newest subscribers. Your support is the soil in which these stories grow, and we are so grateful to have you as part of our community. A huge welcome to Robert E. Matson, Mew Pat, EJ Psy 2975, and Miss King Billy. We are thrilled you're here with us. What did you think of the story of Maxwell and Flora? On a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate their journey from a doodle to a dynasty of love? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And for all of you who have stayed with us to the very end, who believe in the power of a wild garden and an open heart, Please comment with the simple word sanctuary. It means the world to us to know you're here. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more narratives that will build a sanctuary for your soul.